let's move on. So yeah, if you guys want to save your file, you can press Control S, or you can go to File and then Save. You can click on the top bar and navigate to where you would like to save. You know, just PC. And then you can rename your file to something recognizable, like I don't know, prompt I. You can click the file type drop down and make sure it's set to like .ase or asprite, and then just press OK to save it. So everyone, just please save up. It'd be pretty useful if you did that. And then this one. This is like visual aid.
No, that's cool.
Don't you love that impromptu setup? It's so good. Yeah.
Okay, well, let me know.
All right, has everyone saved up? Yep. Okay, moving on. So, Jawsh is gonna be presenting this topic called healthy art practice. I'll let him take it away. Jawsh?
Thank you. Anyways, hello everyone, my name is Joshua, and I'm going to teach you how to have a good mindset when you develop art. It's a pretty tough process. Like, art is very, very hard, and I think it's very, very easy to get really caught up in that. So today I'm going to try and, talk about some ways that people usually do get caught up in it, and some means to kind of help deal with that. So, how do you feel about your art? Generally on a scale of, would you say good or bad? Just thumbs up then. Bad? Okay. Just neutral? Pure neutral. Okay. Good. You like? Oh yeah, totally. Oh, best artist ever. Good, bad. Okay. So, yeah. No. I think so. We do have one dubious. I love my art. It's cool. It's good. And also, hang on. There we go. Yeah, there's that as well. These are probably the two. Actually, I would say the former is very, very rare, frankly. I think a lot of artists generally feel, either like about their art, or actually a little negative about their art. So, we'll talk about what like good or skilled art really requires. So, just a few things, right? So number one, an understanding of light and how it hits objects, line making, understanding of texture, understanding of form, understanding of 3D space, understanding of how light behaves in environments, understanding of anatomy, understanding of composition, understanding of perspective, understanding of color, rendering skills and styles, color palettes, character design, world building, environment and prop design, understanding of medium, abstraction and stylization, framing,
I'll frame you.
understanding of how light and color interact, posing, readability, proportion, understanding of materials, and more. So, be all end all. There's a lot of skills that's involved in order to make art. So many. And in order to really get the hang of those, in terms of both learning and practicing, it takes like a lot of thinking and coordination, especially when you're kind of like a beginner or still an intermediate artist. And that's also on top of the focus that you need to have the willpower to make yourself do art. And even more so if you want art that is important to you in some capacity, if you want to actually express yourself through the medium. So, in order to, ideally get all those concepts in our control, we want to have as much focus and therefore as little distractions as possible. So there's like, obvious normal ones like put away your phone, don't do it in a noisy environment, don't do it when you're at a sleep, stuff like that. But I would argue that probably the more prevalent and more meaningful ones come from internally. So, by the way, big spoiler alert, if you ever want to meaningfully progress on your art whatsoever, you're going to be probably pretty upset. You're going to be upset a lot, actually. I'm very disappointed. And I will go through the process that every artist will go through, naturally. They try to make art. The art fails to meet their expectations. The artist becomes frustrated. And from there you have a few options, right? So, first one, and maybe the most common, give up, right? No. Anyways, the second most common one is probably just taking art with a more casual relationship. There is, just like spoiler alert, there is no need to strongly develop your art skills in this technical or meaningful manner. Like, there is merit in art itself and just doing it for fun. There's quite literally nothing wrong with just drawing so that you have a good time and you have something to present. And yeah, like, as an artist, you have the full freedom to let art do what it wants for you. Yeah. Essentially, yeah, like, be all end all. If you just want to have fun with it, you should just have fun with it. There's no need to have any more pressure than that. Although, there are still many reasons to want to continue to learn and grow and develop our skills. And by its nature, that means you're going to make a lot of very questionable pieces. As I've mentioned, with the enormous amount of concepts and like topics that I mentioned before, there's a lot of ways to mess up art in really, really spectacular and difficult ways. These examples I've shown here. Number one is just an anatomical diagram of the human body. It's very, very complicated. There's about, 3 to 4 muscles of their own individual shape and their own individual forms and their own individual functions in every single segment of your body. There's perspective as well. That's probably another big one that trips a lot of people up. Anyways, point is, by nature of progressing in a difficult field, you're going to encounter a lot of difficulties. And if you don't know how to deal with that, it's going to be pretty rough. So, but before we get into how we deal with that, have any of you had any of these sort of thoughts? I'm terrible at art. I can't even draw a circle. I'm so bad at this. This is so difficult. I can already tell this will be bad. I'll probably never be as good as the artist I like. So, these are examples of abyss statements, or statements that suggest and solidify self-doubt, inadequacy, and frustration, and so on. They are art killers. There is nothing more lethal to your career as an artist as having these thoughts and letting them circulate around your mind. So, this is usually that kind of like abyssy spiral that happens if you have these thoughts in your mind. So, it's pretty similar to just a general artist loop. You try making art, it doesn't go so well. Oh my god, it's horrible. Why did I think it was going to turn out good? And generally you either like give up on that piece or you press on and have to deal with these criticisms that you come up with. So, and just some fun little etymology. So the word abyss, it comes from a Greek. It basically just means depthless. And essentially that translates to something that is either too deep to be measured or it either means something that's too deep to be measured or something that's so shallow and superficial that it has no depth at all. Abyss statements carry these same qualities. So we'll go on to immeasurability. A lot of our self-doubts and critiques are objective, frankly, and therefore not really useful gauges of our ability. The fact that we think of things like, oh, I'm so bad at this is terrible, why did I even bother? They don't actually tell us anything meaningful. And through that, they have the space and the ability to continue to circulate in my mind as we try and keep understanding why that's the case. So I'll go through an example. Classic one, this isn't good enough, or my art isn't good enough, right? And if you sit down and try and dissect it, what that actually means, you'll realize you'll encounter a lot of logical paradoxes, a lot of logical holes. So, for example, yeah, my art isn't good enough. Good enough for what? What criteria are we using to designate this as good enough or not? Not good enough for ourselves? Is this criteria built for us individually? Is it built for how it appears to others? Do we actually even know? Why are we making all these assumptions based on something that we don't even understand? Another one is, what does good enough even look like? Like, at what point of the skill level in art will you need to be to become good enough to make art? Because, anyone can make art. You don't have to be good enough you don't have to be good at all to make art. So this really doesn't make any sense. And finally, enough implies an ultimate point. So realistically, do you think one day you're going to be drawing and going away and learning and getting good at getting skills and think, okay, well, all of my art is good enough now, time to stop, no need to draw anymore? It's absurd. Statements like these are ridiculous, without logic. So, and we'll go into how they're shallow. They aren't, entirely meaningless, like abyss statements. They still have something that they come from something. And that's generally the sort of like nervous, doubting feelings that sort of come around whenever you see something that just, isn't up to your expectations. And abyss statements like these have a habit of sounding really, really concrete and really, really strong to us when, again, they mean nothing. Like for a few examples here, the lighting looks off. I'm not cut out for this. My color palette looks terrible. What am I meant to do with this information? This is so useless. Could you imagine if a teacher or a friend told you this as like critique or feedback? You'd say that's entirely absurd. Why are you telling this? What am I meant to do with this? Statements like these, and so we can see that by its nature, statements like these are kind of useless to have. Anyways. So, on that note, it's best to judge our thoughts and thereby the critiques and evaluations we have on our art through their value to us as artists, not on the accuracy of the thoughts themselves. So here's another example. The piece I made is terrible. The lighting looks really, really bad. Even if that's the case, even if you do make a piece that you do think is genuinely terrible and the lighting is poor or inaccurate in some way, again, there's nothing we can do with that information. Thoughts, like, even if it's correct, like, even if there was an objective way to say, hey, this lighting looks objectively bad and this piece is objectively terrible, this is entirely useless to us in our art career. So it's best so now that you understand that these kind of thoughts and this kind of thinking is both useless and baseless, you now have the opportunity to kind of step back and realize the way that you're thinking and the way that you're observing your own skills. Anyways, the way you do that was with reframing. So you have a few strategies you can use to manage abyss statements, constructive mindsets, reevaluate what failure means to you, and to disengage entirely and to compose yourself. Anyways, so we'll go into constructive mindsets. So essentially, when you see that a piece is unappealing or fails in some way, it's inevitable, actually. Like, there's not going to ever be a point in your life where you're going to always make nice pieces forever. Sometimes it's just going to suck. But the way that we can examine those feelings and the thoughts we can sprout from those kinds of situations can certainly be controlled. So the best way to do that is to, when you notice yourself catching these sort of like abyssy thoughts, things like, oh, this is so terrible, why am I even bothering? Why is this piece looks so bad in this way? Try and reframe them in ways that are constructive to you, that would be really beneficial to learn from. Objective, tangible ones, free of subjective and opinionated language, such as, this is terrible, this looks kind of sloppy, this looks wrong. And also a holistic critique in general of your art helps as well, bringing up strengths and weaknesses, not just saying, oh, this looks terrible, and saying like, oh, well, this certain part of the piece is a little bit weaker than the others, but I really enjoy this part as well. And finally, on top of that, trying to build meaningful direction out of what you can see. So here's one of my pieces from a few months ago. I hate it to bits. I never liked this one, and I gave up. And so the thoughts that I kind of had when I first started was like this, right? Really, like, kind of, they sound like they actually tell you something, but really there's nothing at all. If you can't read it, I wrote the proportions are off, the silhouette's kind of gross, the line work is poor, The hands are kind of weird, lame perspective, boring clothes, etc., etc. So, you know, very downery thoughts. And here is an example of what I do, which would be more constructive critique in general. So this is what positives have done, right? So we have some interesting, in terms of the composition, I really enjoyed the symbolism here between this character, in that she's holding like really daintily this like kind of beautiful little flower thing going on, and this like flat angular conical flask. And that sort of kind of sets her up in this position of, oh, she's clearly responsible or in some connection to like, yeah, something natural and something clinical and cold. It's an interesting contrast. These are two different aspects. The green in her palette also gives us a link to the same plant as well. It's the same hue, it's the same shade. We've got an angular pose as well, which is further building on that kind of like clinical, cold, scientific look. Her shoulders just at a perfect, her elbow is at a perfect right angle. And the color palettes really make, you know, her skin tone and her hair pop out from her otherwise really green look. And here are the downsides that I've also done with the constructive mindset. So there's a few anatomical issues I've noticed, like her legs are a little bit wonky down there, and her shoulders are, while they are sort of in service to kind of emphasizing that angular, like held up look, they're done in a way that's anatomically wrong and doesn't exactly emphasize or convince us of either a really powerful pose or that she's actually a human being with normal shoulders. And also, you can point out littler things easier in this way as well, like the thumb and the left hand is kind of weird. It shouldn't be that long. And yeah, and so on. So, another way to consider and counter abyssy mindsets is to learn that failure is subjective, actually, even though it may really, really feel like it's not. So one example that I really like is considering it in the way of like exercise and fitness. So essentially, when we do exercises, for literally every single one, you set reps to best match your ability, your physical ability at the time, and also at a pace that you're most comfortable with. So if you have an exercise that you can only do like 3 or 4 reps on, that means you're way overloading yourself. That means it's too hard, and you're probably going to like, you know, tear something down there. But also in that same vein, if you have an exercise that you can do like 100 reps of, or forever even, that means you're doing something far below your skill level. The fact that you are not meeting that roadblock means that you aren't developing either. Which means that necessarily, in order to improve at exercise and physical fitness, it's to fail within a reasonable time frame. The point of exercise is to reach a point where you physically cannot continue something anymore. The ideal exercise is one that we can't do perfectly, and one that we can't do easily. And it's the same case for art. From everyone, from someone who's just started to someone who's really, really tenured in the field. Failure is universal, necessary, and desirable to growth. The fact that you can see the ways that you're failing, the ways that something looks mediocre or poor or wrong or inaccurate, means you're on the right track. It means you're right at the cutting edge of your skill, if you can see that. It means you're developing yourself. So that also means there will never be a point where you will be 100% satisfied with every single thing you make. That's just impossible. Unless you only ever do things that are incredibly easy and you can do indefinitely for 1,000,000 reps or so on. So, Essentially, yeah, no matter how good you get, you will never be fully rid of the feeling of failure. And that's something you should be happy for. The fact that you can encounter failure within your art on a regular basis still shows that you have places to grow and places to expand and develop your skills. Yeah, in the same way that athletes do exercises that puff them out, artists will create pieces that show their shortcomings. So, this is my reel of artists who look like really skilled and accomplished, right? And they all feel the exact same way. That same tinge of failure and even some abyssy statements coming in through. So there's this little dog guy, he's got a little poncho, it's cool. I love the color palettes. This is what the artist had to say. An ugly experiment, because just casual, just threw that together in 10 minutes, sort of thing. This next piece, which is this kind of like werewolfy guy. And you can see a very strong grasp of anatomy, like the shoulders, the torso, and the legs. Like they all have very like strong and defined muscles and joints that give a convincing impression of like an animal. And this is what they had to say about it. After fixing this and that, it eventually failed. Literally labeling it as a failure. And finally, we have this person who's done a fairly rough mock-up job, but still quite a convincing impression of clothing and fabric, and very ornate ones too. And they're doing a little, they're like, whatever. So, the final tool we have in order to deal with negative and poor statements is disengagement. And this is probably the easiest one to implement as well, and one that you're maybe most familiar with. But essentially, as by the nature of us as artists, we're going to be staring at our canvases for a very, very long time. And because we're designing and we're putting down every single brushstroke and every single piece and every single part of the composition, we are going to notice every single thing that went wrong in that entire process. So even if you do have like this positive mindset of knowing that, this is actually a sign that I'm growing and developing and pushing my skills, it can still be really, really hard to sit down and make a piece and think, man, that sucks. So here's some ways to kind of deal with that. Breaks, classic. Half-hour ones are especially good just because if you stare at a canvas, or if you stare at something close by you for more than like 25 minutes or something, you get like short-sightedness or something. Anyways, tend to your other needs, there's nothing wrong with going out, like taking a bath, shower, have go on a little walk, have some food or something, usual. A really good one is to actually just leave the piece entirely for 24 hours at least, just because that period of time, and especially just going to bed and then waking up the next day, that period of time in between like consciously designing and inventing everything that you're making right now and then being able to see it with like a fresher, later set of eyes can like really help you feel, more calm, better about it. Next one is consume creative media that you like. I know sometimes.
All right, thank you, Jawsh. If you guys want to return back to that topic, which I really suggest you guys do, it is going to be uploaded to our resources, and you'll see like a QR code to access those resources at the end of the slides. Yeah. Anyway, today we're going to be covering basics of lighting now. So we're going to cover lighting as a tool, shower analogy, basics of light, complex factors, applying shading, and then do our first exercise. All right. Yeah. So yeah, lighting is a pretty important tool that you must consider when you're making art. Light's primary use is to often give and emphasize the volume of a form, right? So you can see a sphere here, which is flat and unshaded. It just looks like a regular circle. But once you add a bit of shading to it, it can suddenly look very nice. It can look very voluminous. It can look, shiny. It can also do three things. It can generate focus, guiding the eye to certain pieces or characters of interest in your art. It can establish space in a scene and help frame it. and it can establish the mood of a character or scene, maybe even the personality of something, based on like the lighting, you know. So yeah, here's some example. Yeah. Sorry. Here's some examples that I found online. The first one is by Rough X Out. It's basically just a skeleton that's standing atop a pile of skeleton heads. But you can see that it is in the light, it is standing above, it is looking happy, it is looking proud. It's got this very empowering kind of like lighting shown onto it. Whereas like there's a very grim pile of heads that's just like kind of like hidden by like the very dim lighting in this area. You can see The Last of Us here as well, where there's Ellie. You can see there's a sort of spotlighting happening here, where there's all these God rays impacting Ellie. It's showing her like in the middle of the frame. You got all this lighting that's like really emphasizing who she is as a character, like she's in the light. Whereas we got these two other characters who are like helping frame the shot. They're in the dark, and the same kind of motif is also like exuded there. You can see that there's like a character who's sitting in the light. They seem happy. They're happy. They're feeling good. Whereas like there's a character in the shadows as well who's also feeling quite sad, quite depressed, and it's kind of exuded with like the colors as well. Here are some more examples of like kind of directional lighting. You can see there's a spotlight happening here where it's like showcasing two characters and then like the magnitude of this imposing head. Like you can't really tell what that creature is, but you know it's fucking big. Similar to here, we got the Terminator. We got like lighting coming up from the back. It makes it look very intimidating, very scary. But you also see like the two piercing eyes that's coming from it. And then there's another like example of like a spotlighting. You see this massive fucking building, but there's a very tiny character that's showcased in the middle, in the bottom middle of the frame, shown by the light. Yeah. And then yeah, you can see like how the lighting over there kind of directs your eyes upwards, and then over here you can see how the lighting frames is shot. There's a character who's climbing up a tree, whereas like everything else is in the shadow, so your eyes are obviously focusing on the character in the light. So yeah, here's a kind of analogy that you can take for understanding lighting. Imagine taking a shower and you're standing still. You can feel the water hitting you. You know where you're wet and where you're dry, right? Light works very similar to this. We are going to use two assumptions for this analogy. First, water does not follow gravity. It just kind of hits you, not much else. And second, the water does not roll off your skin. So when it hits you, it either just gets absorbed or bounces off. Based on this, you know there are like clear areas of wet and dry. You know, like if the shower is in front of you, your face and your body's going to get wet, whereas behind you, it's going to be dry, right? Yeah. So here's some examples. Oh, shoot. So here's some examples of that sort of shower head. You can see the first picture, you have a shower head coming from the top. So there's like the top region of the sphere is getting wet, whereas the bottom region is going to be dry. Similarly, you have a shower head from the side. And again, we're going to assume that there's no gravity here. So only the side of the sphere gets wet, whereas the behind of it is pretty much dry. It gets no water at all. Yeah, this is actually similar to point lighting. So you can see here we have a little light source at the top, and that's lighting up this part of the sphere, like the top part, whereas the bottom part is in shadow. You can't see any of it. And that's the same thing with the light source from the side. You can see that the sphere is lit up from the side, but there's nothing on the left side of it. It's just in pure darkness. So yeah, both of these light sources are called point sources. There's a few properties that you have to consider for these. They have a finite range, so think of a torch, a lamp, any kind of light source. After a certain distance, the light basically loses all brightness. And the strength and the intensity of the light also affects its range. So obviously if you have a really bright flashlight, it can go much further than if you have a really dim, shitty warehouse stationary flashlight. Light also spawns from a point and kind of just goes in all directions, but you can encase it. So like flashlights, the shower head can have an encasing that restricts like where the line of sight is, i.e. like the angle and the region that the light source or the shower head can cover. So yeah, that's kind of what happens with the flashlight, right? You have an encasing around like the light source, and it's making sure that the light source only comes in one direction. Yeah. There's also intensity that you have to consider. The further your light source, the exponentially weaker it can become. The strength of a light source also influences the intensity of the light. So on the left here, you can see the shower head is very close and it's kind of bigger, so it's going to be much more impactful. Whereas on the right, you have a weaker and further light source, so it's going to have a much more smaller effect on the lighting that you can observe on the sphere. Generally speaking, light direction influences where shadows can form. So, the different light directions are common depending on the mood. If you have a light source coming in from the top left, obviously the bottom right of your character is going to be in shadow, and vice versa. And just if you move the light source around, obviously different parts of your body is going to be covered up from just the light or the shower not really hitting you there. It's important that you kind of avoid using a light source when you're actually making art that's right in front of you or front of the character. It makes it look flat, and it can often be called pill shading. So yeah. There's also another sort of light source that you have to consider. So imagine, there's a rainstorm happening. Here's a sphere with an umbrella. You can see that the sphere is dry from all the rain, but obviously the umbrella is getting all the rain. Let's imagine the rain comes in from the kind of like an angle now. Suddenly, only part of the umbrella is getting wet. The other part, like on the left, it's not getting wet at all. And also, because the sphere doesn't move its fucking umbrella, it ends up also getting wet. So you can see part of the sphere is also getting wet because the direction of the light source or the shower has changed. So this is often called direct lighting. Direct lighting is a stronger cousin of point lighting. There's a few key differences that this has. Intensity does not decay with distance. So basically, think of sunlight. If you go 5 meters away from your original spot, the sunlight intensity is going to be exactly the same. There's no difference. The light is already pretty strong enough to go a few thousand miles to get here, so I'm sure it can go a few meters without getting any weaker. And the angle of the lighting is the same for all objects. The only way this changes is if we're working at a larger scale where the light source position is more obvious, like here, we're working at a bigger scale where you can see there's different trees around this light source. So obviously the angle of the lighting is kind of changing. And if the above is the case, we kind of treat this like a very intense point source. So obviously, if you're going to light up an object, you are going to have shadows. So there are two types of shadows that matter. There are form shadows, which are shadows that form on the main object, caused by its surface not facing the light. So you can see here on the right, the kind of the top right part of the sphere is facing the shower head, so obviously it's getting wet, obviously it's getting lit up, whereas the bottom side of the sphere is not. It's pretty dry, it's going to form a shadow. Cast shadows are different. These are shadows put onto another surface by an object in the way of the light. So consider when your art has multiple objects. You're probably going to have an object right next to each other that is going to cast a shadow onto it. So you kind of have to consider that. Examples, obviously character shadows in games. When you're walking over a surface, you're going to have a little character shadow that's beneath your feet. That is cast shadow. So here you can see an example of cast shadows, right? So here's a shower head. Obviously, part of the surface, part of the ground is going to get wet, and so is part of the sphere. But there's going to be a dry spot because the sphere is kind of occluding that, right? Light is exactly the same. There's going to be points, there's going to be a cast shadow that forms because the sphere is occluding it. And you can see with the kind of lines how, as you get further away from the light source, and as the sphere stands in the way, those parts of the surface are going to get blocked off from the light source. For cast shadow, you also need to account for the object's shape. The previous examples were all spheres, but if you're going to work with something like a cylinder, a cone, a cube, etc., you have to also account how that shape is going to impact what kind of shape the shadow forms. So here you can see obviously the cone forms a triangular shadow, whereas the sphere here, depending on the direction, it's going to form a sort of really elongated oval. For cast shadow, you also need to account for the lighting direction and the surface direction angle. So the more angled your lighting, the more, basically the longer your light shadow becomes. So you can see here, like the light on the left is directly over the sphere, so there's a very small shadow being formed. But as we kind of angle the light, you can see like the shadow's getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And that's something you got to consider when you're like determining the direction of your light source. If you're going to put it like right in front of you, then your cast shadow is going to be super big. Whereas if you put it right above you, there's going to be like a very small cast shadow. Yeah. So there's a few complex factors you also account for in lighting. So what happens when you have multiple light sources? Or let's say, what if you have multiple showers? Let's imagine these showers spray out painted water. So this one sprays out a very like dark navy blue water, and this one sprays out a very like light teal water. If we combine these, we basically end up with something like this. So yeah, we kind of overlap them based on their intensity. There's a few things to note here. The brightest light, or like the strongest shower head, or just like the brightest shower, takes precedence. The darker navy light is under the bright teal light because it is darker. So you do not want to like have a darker color on top of a brighter color. The shadow area has actually gotten smaller compared to the previous examples. So yeah, because we're overlapping these two light sources, so less of the area, less of a shadow has formed. And if there's two light sources that have the same intensity, the colors will mix as well. You don't see it here, but this will be based on like RGB. Don't worry about this, we're not kind of care about blending today. So yeah. What happens when it's just raining, you know, when there's no puddles and you're dry, but your shoes are getting wet? What's happening there? Why are your shoes getting wet? Usually the reason for this is because there's reflection happening. Oh. So you can see here, it's kind of a bit faint, but you can see like how as a raindrop falls onto the ground, it kind of bounces off the surface, right? Eventually some of that bouncing raindrops are going to hit your shoes. They're going to hit the sphere. And you can see like the underside of the sphere is a little bit lit up because of the reflected light. Intense sources of light can cause light to bounce into the shadow of an object and kind of light it up. But be warned, this is commonly caused by direct sources like a bright sunny day or intense studio lights. This bounce light will never be brighter than the main light. So you can see on the right, you can see on the left, we have something in pure shadow. We are not considering like any bounce light, but once we start like considering, oh look, you know, light is coming from this direction, it's going to kind of bounce into the shadow. You can see a bit of the shadow is way more lit up than the left, but the shadow is still much, much darker than this area, right? Often the bounce light will have the same color as the surface it bounces from. So here we're working with grays and whites. So the bounce light is going to be white. But if you were bouncing red light onto an object, there's going to be a bit of red light bleeding into the shadow. The more angled the light source is compared to the surface of an object, the more directional the bounce lighting is. So bounce is still quite random, so parts of your shadow will still be softly lit up. Sorry. Yep. So bounce is still quite random, so parts of your shadow will still be softly lit up. But yeah, as you can see here. But the more angular you make the light source or the rain or whatever, it becomes more obvious where like the bounce lighting is going to form. And different materials will obviously bounce differently. Like if you have a very like clean, glossy, smooth material, it's going to bounce pretty much in this direction and never like any other direction. But if you have a very rough material like this, it means like the bouncing will just occur like all over the place. It can bounce into any part of the sphere. Yeah. So there's also a factor called ambient inclusion, which you have to consider when you're making art. And this is kind of like an extension of bounce lighting. So most shadows are obviously not in pure darkness. There are going to be sort of ambient lighting that occurs within a shadow. But some sources like ambient light includes, you know, far away or really faint light sources. The sky, you know, it's a major ambient light source for outdoor art, or foggy and atmospheric light. Like if you see my arm here, you can see that obviously there's all this light coming from the top, but clearly this part is still lit up. You can still see that the bottom of my arm clearly has like a bit of like lighting to it. Otherwise it would just be pure black, right? So it's important that, oh look, you know, this source is kind of bouncing off onto my arm, or the floor is bouncing off onto my arm, or like those light sources from the far end of the room are also bouncing onto my arm. It's important to consider those factors as you're making your art. These sources obviously help light up the shadow, reducing the amount of darkness. And if you want to determine if something has ambient occlusion, you have to consider, are there two objects right next to each other, and how strong or weak the light sources are. So yeah, this is a scene which has like pretty much no ambient occlusion happening. We just assume that it's in pure shadow, but obviously real life does not look like this. So if you add in a bit of ambient lighting or reflected lighting, suddenly it looks so much nicer. So you can see there's a lot of reflected light. There's a lot of like light near the edges of the shadow, whereas as you get further into like the creases, the nooks and crannies of a given object, like you can see in the cube at the bottom, you can see there's still a much more prominent shadow forming at like the kind of corners. This is because like light kind of works like it's kind of randomized, but if you're working in a crease, it's much harder for the light to reach there. So you can see like in the creases, it'd be really hard for the light to reach there and bounce into there. Whereas in the more exposed faces of this cube or the sign up there, you can see like it's much easier for the light to kind of bounce off onto the wall and into like the crease there. So yeah. Generally speaking, this is the kind of steps that you want to apply when you're like shading a character. Consider first, you want to consider how lit up your scene or character is. Is there a single light source or multiple light sources? And how close are they to each light source? And then for each light source, you want to establish its direction and intensity. So recall, the further the light source, the weaker it is. You know, how strong is a shower head or how strong is a rain that's like applying to the light, to the object? And then for the shadows, you want to consider if there's any ambient light sources acting on it. You know, the sky, any faraway sources, etc. This is going to influence how dark the shadows are and if you want to brighten up or anything. And also like the color of it. You also want to determine the base shade or value of your objects. Is the object naturally dark or is it naturally bright? Obviously, a mouse like this, which is black, is not fully lit up. There's still like, there are going to be parts of it that are lighter, but obviously it's not like pure white in the light. Whereas, I guess this cleaner over here, which is white, it gets pretty bright. It gets pretty close to white, or at least pretty close to the intensity of the light source. So like the color of the light source. And then you want to apply the basic lights and shadows. You can be pretty rough with this and just start cleaning it up. And then consider the reflectivity of a material. Is your object naturally reflective? Like a glossy reflective material will much more clearly show like bounce lighting and highlights, whereas a more like rough or matte material it rarely kind of shows reflected light as much and lacks highlights. So yeah, this is kind of like this is the kind of like general process I go through when I'm like shading a sphere. So here's an application of it. You know, I put the light source in front of the sphere and off center. So then I went in with like a basic I drew the shape. I went through two routes. I could either like cast it in shadow, have the base color be in shadow, or have the base color be in light, and then add in a shadow. And then that's how you end up with like a sphere in the middle. And then there's two routes. I can either go with it being a rough material, which means there's no reflective light considered for it, so it just ends up being the same. Or I can make it a glossy material, where it has reflective light and highlights added to it. So you can see like how there's a bit of like an under lighting happening here, and then at the end you add a little bit of a highlight over here, just to make it look pretty. And kind of just show how reflective it is. Here's a few shading pitfalls. Basically, you want to avoid light sources from completely in the center or completely above. This kind of makes the character look flat and doesn't really convey the volume of the item. And you also just want to avoid the example on the left. Like it just creates like an uneven gradient. So I'll let you guys actually like try to practice that. Yeah. So hopefully everyone downloaded the folders full of content. If you guys haven't, just like raise your hand and I can come around with the USBs. There's going to be a first exercise called shading volumes, where you obviously copy the folder with the lesson 2 exercises, open the file lesson 2 exercise 1, observe the different light sources that I've like put around these objects. So you can consider like how close the light source is and its direction, and the dimmer lamps indicate like a lower intensity light source. So factor that in, and then shade using the main 3 colors in the palette that's like on the middle right. Yeah. And treat them as like reflective objects. So yeah, you guys can get started. I'll give you like 10 minutes to do that. Yeah. We'll move. Oh, what the fuck? Yeah. yeah, all right, we're going to move on to our next topic, colors and palettes. So we're going to be covering like finding palettes, the wheels and the bars, the dance of moods, considering lighting, and then do our second and third exercises, and then our pixel prompt. Although maybe for time, we might skip the pixel prompt for now. So yeah, when you're actually considering color in digital art, we pick most of our colors from the color picker, which you guys might have seen at like the bottom left of your screens when you were drawing. So you can click along the hue bar / wheel to pick whatever like hue color you want, and then you can also pick along the square for like a very specific color based on that hue. So there are 4 sliders to consider: hue, saturation, value, and transparency, although we're not going to be covering that for today. So first off, we have hue. Hue is the main identity of color, i.e. what it is. The range kind of is in a circle, it loops around itself. So we can shift any color in any direction. You can make it redder, bluer, etc. Keep it going, and with time you can end up in the same place. By establishing different hues in your piece, it will be the main way to establish like different colors in your piece. You can see over here we have like all this like hue shifting. We start off with blue, and then we kind of tend to more towards like a green, towards yellow. And on the other end, we're going towards purples, and then magenta, and then also it can go towards yellow. And then on the right, you can see a piece of art where it uses a lot of different hues to make it up. Then we have saturation. It's the level of vibrance or intensity of a color. It's like the chroma. So the higher the saturation, the more of the hue is present. So if we go with this very like neutral pale blue in the middle, if you go towards the right, it becomes much more saturated, it becomes purely saturated. Whereas the lower the saturation, the grayer a color becomes. So if you have no saturation, it becomes a very neutral color. This kind of controls how colorful your pieces are. But be careful, oversaturating and undersaturating your art can be both dangerous if you apply it unintentionally. So you can see on the right, we have a lot of like both neutral and full saturated or like pure colors that are acting there. You have reds that are pure, you have very dismal grays, and there's like kind of like a few in-betweens there. And then we also have value. So value is the brightness or luminosity of color. So the lighter the color, obviously the lighter the value. It's the most important aspect for art because it's the main way we obviously convey light and shadow. It also establishes focus and contrast. And above all, make sure you kind of like master this if you really want to consider yourself like a master of shading, I guess. Yeah. So yeah, if you see here, if you go with a very high value color, it becomes very light, whereas low value, it becomes very dark. That's pretty obvious. There's a thing to kind of consider though. So there's a thing called inherent or perceived value. So the perceived brightness of a color often differs by the hue it has. This is how light or dark color naturally looks, even if it has like a high value on your sliders. So the more vibrant or saturated we make a color, the more its inherent characteristics emerge. So a very pure blue and any like blue adjacent colors have the darkest inherent value. Whereas the more pure yellows and any yellow adjacent colors have the lightest inherent value. And you can see in this color wheel that's become grayscale, how it's gone from like pretty much a very dark color to a very light color based on the blue and yellow dichotomy. And then we have a few factors to consider when you're establishing mood for your picture. So the first thing is temperature. So when we have a very high chroma or saturation, colors can show off a temperature relative to each other. Warmer colors gravitate towards, oh fuck, sorry. Oh god, how do I go back? Oh shit. Sorry. Sorry, yeah. So when we have a high chroma, colors can have a temperature relative to each other. So warmer colors gravitate towards orange, whereas cooler colors gravitate towards blue. Tending a color towards gray can make it look neutral and look like the opposite temperature. So essentially we're making a whiter, which is more desaturated and a neutral color. Then we also have to consider harmony and combination. So most art and art theory is based on red, yellow, blue wheel. Different combinations of colors from this wheel can make your piece look more aesthetically pleasing or even evoke a specific mood. Thus, we can use this wheel to find nice pairings. These pairings or combinations are often called color harmonies. So complementary pairings are the most well known. It just means, red and green or yellow and purple. It requires playing with your saturation and values to make it look good. So, dull reds with a vibrant green or vice versa, or just messing around with it. You can also have monochromatic or analogous palettes, which have less hue variation. So it kind of focuses more on having a good value and saturation. And it's most often it's like the most stable harmony out of all of them. Analogous and split complementary are like natural derivations of their main siblings. So yeah, you can see it in the bottom left, the bottom right. And then you also have triadic or tetradic, which is much less common, but it can be very fun and electric if you use it correctly. Door. All right. Then we have relatively a contrast. All these mood-based vectors have one thing in common. They're relative. Some colors can appear brighter, warmer, happier, depending on your palette. Some colors are even traditionally not seen as these emotions can evoke it in the right context. So this teal, which might seem blue on my fingernails, can seem very warm and inviting if you use it with a very cold palette. Certain colors can also pop out and stand out based on the relative saturation. So if all your colors are soft and desaturated, then if you have bolder saturated colors, they're going to naturally stand out. And you've got to make sure that all of your colors aren't oversaturated or desaturated in your palette. And overall, the most important factor for a range of colors is their inherent value. So even extreme transitions in hue can look good if you ensure that there's consistent transitions in value and saturation. Yeah. Then we have theme. So theme is like the ideas and motives conveyed by your art, impacted by your color choices. A theme is built on multiple factors. You have the range of hues, i.e. do you use all the hues or do you use a very select few based on your color harmonies? You have the range of saturation, like how colorful is it or how desaturated is it? You also have the range of values. Some palettes are very bright, some are very dark. And then you can establish your theme of your art based on multiple factors like genre, emotion, story, setting, symbolism, etc. So different games have different themes, so your color palette is going to reflect that. Even your characters, objects, environments will have their own themes. So you can have a very gritty character set in a very playful environment. And those two can have very different color palettes and themes associated with that. So yeah, first example is we have Stardew Valley. You can see there's very bright, vibrant colors happening here all over the screen. It's kind of to evoke a much happier, calmer, nicer, friendlier kind of emotion because it seems all inviting and very happy. Yeah. Then we have Shovel Knight, which is a classic that some of you might know. It uses a much more retro palette. So it's kind of based on the NES, I think. And you can see there's a lot of very gritty colors, but that's because they're trying to limit it to a very retro art style and retro theme and retro aesthetic. Then we have Helltaker. So you can see this is a color palette that is much more monochrome or very limited. You only have these sort of obsidian blacks. We have very few pales. We have a lot of reds and some yellows to kind of signify important items. So you can see this really reflects the themes of hell and death and lust and all that. And then we have two games called Return. Return by 2023 uses a very simple monochromatic palette, but you can see it helps distinguish the foreground with the background and sets a very gritty, scary theme for the game. Whereas Return on the left, made in 2016, is a much nicer, loftier platformer. So they tend to use pastel colors, which kind of evokes this dreamy, inviting, soft, sleepy aesthetic. If you want to build a palette, you can just find a palette, first of all. Lots of palettes are available for free online, or you can yoink it from other people's art. Best place is from Lowspec. So Lowspec is the best place to get any kind of palette. It can be useful to modify and download. It can be useful to download and then modify any palettes that you install. Yeah, this is a really good place to just grab a bunch of palettes for your art if you want to try it out. But generally the basic steps for building a palette is, first, you select your base color. This is the color you want to use to describe your object. So if you have a black mouse, your base color is going to be black. If you have whatever the fuck this is, there's a lot of base colors for it. This is the main color that you want to introduce lighting and shading to. Then you want to consider your shadow, color, and temperature. So think back to ambient light. Think back to sources like the sky or faraway light sources. Most common shadow color is dark blue because the sky or the atmosphere is inflicting an ambient light onto it. How dark does your shadow actually go? And then you also want to consider like how much of the ambient light color do we want to consider when we're making the palette. Then you also want to consider the lighting color and temperature. It's most common to go warmer with your lighting and your palettes because most light sources are warm. But consider, obviously your actual light source's color and theme. If it's a cool if it's a cooler light source, then you want to reflect that in your palette. It can also be influenced by how bright your surface can actually go. So this is a very matte surface. It can't go very bright. I guess the sides of this mouse are much more glossy, so it can go too white. Yeah. And then you just make your ramp, and you constantly tweak it. Ensure that there's changes in hue and saturation as you make it. And then you kind of just build on that by generating more ramps from all for the other base colors that you have for your piece, or even just start branching from existing colors to make more ramps. Yeah. So then there's a few factors to consider. First, you establish color harmonies. It's pretty useful, complementary, triadic, analogous, etc. These are pretty good tools for just having a general idea for how you want your palette to be built. Then you want to consider your theme, the genre, emotion, story, setting, symbolism, etc. of the object and art. These determine the dullness or vibrancy of your palette. Shit. Yeah, these determine the dullness or vibrancy of your palette, the range of values, the range of hues, all that. And it helps to kind of have some references of your theme to see what kind of colors they use. So if you want to go for a very apocalyptic theme, maybe find some examples online of apocalyptic games and kind of yoink colors from that. And you also want to determine if you have a hard limit on the number of colors you're going to have. We are doing pixel art. A lot of the times palettes have a very hard limit, maybe 1 bit, which means 2 colors max, or more retro styles can have 8 to 16 colors, or 32 colors, or 64. It's up to you. Pixel art is simple, so having too many colors can make something hard to maintain. And yeah. And if you're doing game art, consider if your palette is going to be used for everything or just that object. Retro styles will usually have a universal palette applied to all colors and objects and characters, but you can just have individual palettes for all your objects and characters in your environment. Yeah. So build your palette as you're drawing and figure out what elements you need or want for it and how you want to shade for it. Adjust and tweak the levels as you're drawing. Consider your temperature, theme, harmonies, and sometimes you can just go by intuition. Do you think this color ramp looks nice and achieves your criteria, or does it need adjusting? So we'll just do a second exercise and then kind of just piss off because we are getting late. Yeah. So first, I want you guys to just make a new file with any dimensions. It's cool. And then from the color picker in the bottom left, pick a base color, any color. Pick a random hue, a random saturation or value, but make sure the value is kind of dark or lower. And then as you do that, select the temperature. Do you want to go for a warmer direction or a colder direction? And then based on the temperature, tend the colors towards your chosen temperature as you make it brighter. So make sure you always consider a color's inherent value as you're shifting it. And I want you guys to achieve this with a ramp of 6 colors. So just make sure your color ramp has 6 colors, including the base color that you want to have, or 6 steps. So yeah, I'll give you guys 2 or 3 minutes to do that. Hold on that. So then we have transition ramps. So you want to just pick 2 random colors and place them on separate ends. Make sure they all have different hue and value. Don't use black or white like in the example. And try go for a complementary color pairing. So remember kind of on opposite ends. So red and green, or yellow and blue, or any other similar thing. And then you want to transition between them in 2 ways. You want to have a vibrant route with very high saturation, and then a dull route with very low transition saturation. And then try to achieve this in 3 to 5 steps. So I'll give you guys another 2 minutes to do that. Actually, speaking of going to dull transitions, we're going to do the third one, which is basically an evolution of these 2 exercises, which is branching ramps. So you want to pick a random bright color or just work with whatever you're already working with and place it in the middle. And then in each of the 4 directions, transition it based on 4 criteria. You can make it go towards a desaturated dark, a complementary dark, a colder dark, or a hotter dark. And achieve this in 4 to 5 steps like you can see over here. So yeah, this would have been our third exercise, which is called palette swapping. So you could have opened lesson 2 exercise 3, which is wherever you downloaded it, basically. Then you use the select tool to pick a portion of the colored art, like let's say 25 to 40% of the piece. And then using one of the ramps that you made, I want you guys to replace some of the colors of the cat with your ramp's colors. So you can use Control R and follow the steps listed at the top of the screen. So you can just eyedrop and then, press Control R. And yeah, deselect it and then look at it. Like, how can you transition between these two areas of colors? Can it be left alone, or does it need like a new sort of gradient when you apply these new colors? Yeah. Literally just like you select a bit of the cat and you just like recolor it, and then you see how it looks in the end. And it'd be like a kind of funky experiment if you guys did that. Yeah, the slides will be uploaded very soon. They're going to also be posted in club tutorials. You could have just scanned here for the QR code if you wanted. It's the same folder as last time, if you guys already had that. So yeah. Aside from that, seeing as we already covered lines, shapes, color, and shading, I'll show you my typical process for how I made the slime in our last tutorial. So basically, I did a very rough sketch making 2 ovals. I gave it a very base color, so I just gave it like that magenta. I introduced some lighting in form of like a bit of a highlight and then a bit of a base shadow, because I know this slime is like a bit translucent, so it's got like it's got a bit of a shadow within itself. And then I start fixing up the lines and adding some more shading. And then I added a bit of detailing by introducing a slimy face. Plus I kept on like tweaking the colors that I've like implemented in my ramp. So if you like pay very close attention, you notice that as we kind of progress through the different like stages, I've kept on tweaking the base magenta color to be a bit warmer or a bit colder, just so like it looks nicer for me. And then at the end, I kind of like change up the positioning of the eyes and the shapes. And then I just fix up any details and continue just like fixing up the color ramp until I felt it was nice. So yeah. And yeah, so this would have been your prompt, and it would have basically just been to draw eyeballs again, but using like the knowledge and stuff that you learned from this lesson. So I would have asked you guys to draw an eyeball that's in light and one in dark, so one with very minimal lighting and one with a lot of lighting attached to it. And then you guys would have used more than 2 palettes to kind of render that eyeball out and make it look cool as hell.